Hello, everyone. Today we're going to be looking at cigarette marketing and advertising. And for about the first three quarters, I'm going to focus more on Canadian aspects of this topic. And I'm actually going to be talking about my own research and the book I have coming out soon on the history of cigarette marketing and advertising in Canada. So that'll be about, I think, about an hour or so. And then after the break, we're going to look at Marlboro. All right. So I want to start with women in smoking, and this also ties into what I'll be talking about in terms of my own research, in terms of how women become more, how more of them become cigarette smokers in the mid 20th century. So we'll start with how women were depicted in the context of smoking, tobacco smoking, before the 1920s and 30s. Some of this comes from the Cook article for this week. So prior to that time, so prior to the 1920s and 30s, it was a real strong social taboo for women to smoke tobacco, and especially for them to smoke cigarettes. So a woman who was seen smoking, say tobacco or cigarettes, generally speaking, would have been regarded very negatively. She would have been seen as vulgar, a kind of vamping performance. She would have been cast as being this kind of bohemian type, fringe player on the margins of society, even a prostitute. For one example of this is in Bizet's opera Carmen. Carmen is actually a woman who works in a cigarette factory, hand rolling cigarettes, and there's a kind of sexualized portrayal of Carmen, and that in part has to do with how women were often aligned with sexuality in terms of how men depicted or used women in terms of advertising at this time. We'll get to that in a second. So if you were to look at cigar boxes, for example, during this period, say the late 1800s or early 1900s, what you would see were examples of oftentimes women, sort of so-called ladies of the night, sort of depictions of women on these cigar boxes. Here's an example of one right there now, the image there. Thick hair, rouged cheeks, rosy lips, these sorts of things. It's sort of an alignment of women's sexuality with tobacco products. It tied into or tapped into notions of the so-called little white slaver. I mean, cigarettes were called the little white slaver, which was a reference to the so-called white slave trade. And that was this idea that young white women, if they behaved somewhat inappropriately in a social setting, if they hung out with the wrong crowd, etc., were out too late at night, they risked being kind of lured into the so-called white slave trade, which was a kind of network of people who were bringing women into prostitution in that sense. In fact, there was even a brand of tobacco in the U.S. called the White Slave Tobacco brand, which built on these notions about illicit sexuality with women and the way that men smoked tobacco. Now, at this time, again, the early 1900s, for example, when you see women in cigarette ads or other types of tobacco ads, they're not depicted as protagonists, right? They're not depicted as somebody that you would want to emulate or someone you could identify with or somebody who aspirationally you want to become. Rather, they're a kind of what might be called a type, right? A character, a kind of characterized notion of a female type. And that's often a very much a sexualized, eroticized portrayal. So these are erotic objects, women as erotic objects for the male gaze in tobacco advertising, as opposed to depicting subjectively women as erotic beings in advertising and ways that women could identify with those types of beings. You would not see women smoking in these ads because at this time, no proper woman should be smoking. So the ads wouldn't actually depict women smoking. They would just present a kind of eye candy, sexualized portrayal of women as objects for that so-called male gaze. Now this starts to change starting the late 1920s in the US and Canada. So at this time, you would have about maybe 35% of men who were cigarette smokers, but only about 5 or 10% of women smoke cigarettes at this time. It's very, very low. And so the thinking on the part of cigarette companies is, well, there's a big untapped market. We should start thinking about that. And the challenge here is that you can't be too aggressive with that, because if people in society think it's wrong for women to be smoking cigarettes, then there could be some backlash against tobacco companies for actually bringing women into their marketing equation, right? For having women in their ads and that sort of thing. So there is some carefulness about how you would have done this in the 20s and 30s. Although you can see that after a few years, it doesn't really matter so much, because the social norms are changing really, really quickly around women and cigarette smoking. So these ads that would have started appearing in the late 20s and early 30s in the US and Canada would have targeted women, would have appealed to women. You can see this woman here in this ad is a very different one from the one we saw there, right? You're not really meant to identify with this exoticized woman, sexualized sort of demeanor as well. But here's somebody you can identify with as a young woman or 20-something woman, right? And so you see a lot of advertising that would depict women in a sort of socially respectable context, middle class context. You'll often see sort of recreationally active women in these ads as well. And it reflects some of the changing social norms that are happening as cigarette smoking becomes just more popular in general amongst men. Increasingly, there is a desire to see women share in that type of activity. I mean, for the perspective of women, well, why not? If it's good enough for the men, why not for us? And in fact, one a tobacco merchant in Toronto in the early 1930s wrote, and this is something I have in my book, he's talking about the women who come in to his tobacco shop and they're buying cigarettes, but he said they used to, when they would buy cigarettes, they would ask for it to be put in a brown paper bag and sort of hide them as they left the store, so to speak, so they wouldn't be seen in public carrying them. But he said now they're no longer stealing out furtively with those cigarette packages in paper bags. They're brandishing them proudly. There was one example. It's a great example. It's from 1933, and it's a bride at her wedding. Okay, and she's giving a toast. So imagine you're at your own wedding. You're giving your champagne toast to your guests. Your groom is beside you. And in this one instance, the woman actually has the champagne glass in one hand and a cigarette in the other, right? This is 1933. It's telling you that social norms have really started to change, that an upper class woman could feel comfortable holding a cigarette in her hand in front of her family and friends at her wedding. You start to see more and more in the 30s examples of more explicit kind of sexualized portrayals of women and sort of targeting female sexuality in advertising. So here, these are women now are the subjects, right? They're not the objects. They're women can identify with the women that are depicted in these ads, or may aspirationally wish to identify with them. And in some cases, you actually see the conflation of sexual portrayal and a type of power that goes into this, right? So if you look at this ad here, do you inhale? Well, that's a kind of innuendo, right? For do you do something else in terms of a romantic setting. And so more and more you start to see cigarettes as a way to kind of be suggestive of sexuality for women, because women in the 1930s could not be explicitly clear about sex. They couldn't talk about sex, especially with men if they were single. So cigarette smoking was a way to kind of be suggestive about erotic desire and the rest. And it was also a way to sort of enhance one's sense of independence and power at this time. Cook, the reading for this week, writes that cigarettes functioned as erotic signifiers, providing otherwise respectable women a license to develop and exercise a sexually charged and independent persona in ways that probably would not have been possible for them given the restrictive societal norms that govern women's behavior. Right? So smoking is a way that you can kind of communicate sexual desire without being labeled like a tramp or a slut or whatever we would say today or something like that, right? It was a sort of socially permissible way to express sexual interest and desire on the part of women at this time. The other thing you start to see is that more and more cigarette advertising, and even the way women talk about cigarettes in the 1930s and early 40s, is this idea that cigarette smoking is something you do in public because the men can do it in public. It used to be that there was a real social taboo on women smoking privately, but especially in public. And so there's more and more this sense that women are exercising their equal rights with men, and demonstrating that by smoking a cigarette while doing so. One example of that is another tobacco merchant in Canada in 1937, and he writes, "This summer especially, I've noticed a good many women smoking on the street, exercising their equal rights with men." So what that means is you've got to look at the context here, right? It's the 1930s. Women only got the vote in 1920. Even in the 1930s, there are still areas of law in which women are not equal to men in terms of the way the law treats them. There are forms of social discrimination that women still encounter. There are places in public where women really should not, well, either they're explicitly not allowed to be, like a tavern or a bar, or other types of public spaces where society or social restrictions exist in terms of what's socially acceptable for them to be there, right? So women are not operating like men in terms of having the kind of experiences in public life that men do, right? They are operating under these restrictions still. And in a way to sort of defy those and to exercise a sense of equality on the part of women, cigarette smoking becomes an example of that. The other things you'll see in ads, you'll see women sort of doing sports like playing tennis or riding horses or other things. And again, it says that traditionally it was only men that were seen as suitable for playing sports. Now women should be seen as equally capable of playing those sports, and cigarettes align themselves with that equality message there. More and more you're going to see that colleges and universities are allowing women to smoke on their campuses or in their residences and dorms. And you're seeing more and more workplaces in the 30s and 40s allowing people to smoke inside, including places where it's traditionally female dominated. The other change that's happening is smoking on cinema, right? Hollywood, this is the 1930s, is the era of the talkies, right? This is where sound film becomes the dominant form of movie going. So you get this huge increase in the output of Hollywood production that happens in the 1930s. And one study looked at a sample of 1930s films and looked at the way smoking was represented in those films. And interestingly enough, it found that 30% of the female heroes in a movie, like the female protagonists in a movie, were smoking, but only 3% of female villains were smoking. So it tells you something, right? From the standpoint of movie makers, the idea is that if you've got a favorable character, you can have her smoking because that will just shore up or affirm her favorability or desirability on the part of the viewers, right? So you see lots and lots of women on the screen in the 1930s smoking and doing it often glamorously or at least in a socially desirable way. Marlene Dietrich in the film Morocco in 1930, she orders her male companion to, quote, "cigarette me, big boy." Jean Harlow in Hell's Angels, again in 1930, asks a young soldier if he wants to come up for a cigarette and a drink to her apartment, right? Of course, that's innuendo for something else. Linking cigarettes to sexual desire that we talked about before in that advertising also becomes a feature of Hollywood cinema, and especially the way women are depicted in those films. The sex symbol Mae West smoked cigarettes often in her movies, but especially in films like I'm No Angel and She's Done 'Em Wrong. So smoking, women smokers in movies could telegraph sexual desire, right? It seems odd to us, but actually smoking a cigarette suggestively, blowing the smoke at a prospective love mate or a suitor or something like that, was seen as a form of sexual invitation and desire. It was attractive. And you would see this over and over again in Hollywood cinema. Now, what happened in 1934 with the Hays Production Code, even that will increase the amount of smoking portrayals in movies. And the Hays Production Code was essentially a deal that Hollywood made with some social conservatives and religious groups in the U.S. Those groups were saying that there was too much explicit kind of sexuality that was happening in Hollywood cinema. It was nothing at all like you'd see today, but anyway, too much intensive kissing or whatever the case may be. And so the Hollywood producers responded by saying, okay, we're going to bring in this production code, and we're just going to have these, we're going to agree to certain types of things we will not depict on screen that involved explicit sexual activity, like certain forms of kissing or something. And that did happen. But what it meant is that sexuality is an important aspect of desire, and often what can be very captivating from the standpoint of a viewer. So you need to somehow communicate that in a movie if you have men and women who are becoming love interests of a sort. And so one of the ways you do that is by smoking, right? And so, for example, Bette Davis, one of the great Hollywood actresses from the 1930s, in her movie It's Love After in 1937, she blows smoke in her lover's face as a form of sexual invitation. It seems something crazy today, right? That if you did that today, you're probably not going home with someone. But this was a way for people to communicate a kind of form of sexual activity almost that's not explicitly happening before you, but is implicitly happening through smoking and the blowing of the cigarette smoke. Okay, so that's the kind of an overview of women and how they came to become recognized smokers in the U.S. and Canada, say by the 1940s. There were virtually no stigmas attached to women by the 1940s in terms of them being cigarette smokers, as there had been, say, 25, 30 years before. All right. Now, I want to focus more on this book I have. It's called Cigarette Nation. And I want to take you through a couple of the things I talk about in this book. I mean, obviously, I'm not going to talk about lots because it would take too much time. But I want to sort of start you with sometimes what you call that kind of key question you have, right? That key research question that becomes the elevator pitch sort of description of what your book is about, that sort of 1 or 2 minute statement about it. And in my case, when I was starting to do research on this topic, one of the things I noticed early on were some statistics, and I've just sort of put some of them up here, right here. And you can see that this is these are for per capita daily cigarette sales per adult in Canada. So in 1950, on average, every adult smoked 4.9 cigarettes a day. Let's say 5 cigarettes a day. Now, not everyone was smokers, right? So that meant that, let's say if half the population smoked, that meant half had 0 and the other half had, say, 10. So it gives you a sense of what we mean by per capita daily, right? So what you notice here is that in every 5-year period, there's an increase in the per capita daily cigarette sales in Canada. They go up and up and up. And in fact, by 1980, they're almost double what they were in 1950. Now, when we talk about per capita, that means you're controlling for population growth, right? It means it's not so much that there's a more cigarette sales 30 years later because there's a larger population. You're controlling for per capita, right? So on average, each individual would smoke or would buy X number of cigarettes in a day, or consume X number of cigarettes in a day. So it's sort of, you look at that and go, that's really interesting. But then the real question is, in the early 1950s, starting around 1952, 53, 54, that is when medical science starts to release the results of studies linking cigarette smoking to lung cancer. Now, lung cancer then was a very, very serious disease. About 90% of people would die from it. And today, it still is a very, very serious disease. The death rate isn't 90%, but it's probably around 70% or whatever. It hasn't really improved that much. So what does it say when the news about smoking being linked to lung cancer, which starts in the early 1950s and is reported on extensively in newspapers and magazines, and people are generally aware of that information. Whether they believe it or not is a different issue. But what does it say when all of this news about lung cancer and smoking is happening during the 1950s and 60s? And yet, the rates of smoking in terms of cigarette sales increases during this period. Arguably, the best years for the cigarette industry in Canada came after the lung cancer news happened, rather than in the decades before that. And so that's the kind of research question I have here in the bottom, which is like, how do you account for high smoking rates or high cigarette sales rates from the 1950s to the 80s in light of the evidence linking cigarettes to lung cancer? And that becomes a kind of guiding, overarching kind of question on the part of a researcher like myself, is that I got to figure out all these factors that would go into explaining that in terms of making the book, successful or not, I suppose. So I'm going to talk about a couple of the things that I looked at in terms of that, and certainly if you want to ask me more about this in the class on Tuesday, go right ahead. There's lots more to talk about, but I'm going to focus just on a couple things for that. Now, before I do that, I want to just also say that this research that I'm talking about, the research that's in my book, I've also been doing related research for provinces like Ontario and New Brunswick, provinces that are suing tobacco companies to recover healthcare costs that were linked to Medicare costs that were linked to smoking and dealing with that in the healthcare setting. So these claims are very large. I think every province has one of these court cases, and it's I think the total is about $150 billion against the tobacco industry. And these claims typically center on historical smoking. So somebody who starts smoking in the 1960s may not actually get ill from smoking until the 1990s or something, right? Or 2000. So if you're going to say we have all these smoking-related healthcare costs in the 90s, you really actually have to go back to the context of the 1960s to understand why people chose to smoke, what the tobacco companies were doing at that time to target people and to convince them to become smokers, etc., etc. And you have to see whether or not the tobacco companies are doing and saying things that in fact violate the law, or they are fraudulent, or they're engaging in a form of breach of trust, etc. And so my position as an expert witness, I work with the provinces who are suing the tobacco companies, because I actually believe that much of what the tobacco companies were doing was very problematic. And my book also reflects some of that as well. But I'm not going to talk so much about that. So I'm going to look at, instead, I want to look at how the tobacco companies responded to the concerns that people might have about smoking being linked to cancer, and how they did marketing changes and marketing innovation, product innovation as well, to alleviate those worries or concerns that people had. So the so-called cancer scare starts around 1952, 1953. And that's, as I said, it's essentially lots of news stories coming out saying, hey, everyone, there's more and more compelling evidence that smoking causes cancer. Now, the tobacco companies denied that. In fact, they argued, sort of like Trump does with respect to lots of things. They said there's no evidence for it. It was basically fraudulent. That research was bunk. And in fact, there are other things that cause lung cancer, like air pollution or something like that. So that was the sort of public position of the tobacco companies. But they also had a kind of marketing position. They realized that people would have some concerns about this, even if they denied it. And so they had to think about ways to give people the impression that certain types of cigarettes were safer to use. So the first form of this health reassurance marketing came in the form of filters. So before the cancer scare, you can see in 1951, 52, only about 2% of cigarettes have filters on them. You can see by 1962, it's well over half. So the thinking is that if you put a filter on a cigarette, people would come to believe that it made the cigarette safer, that the filter would sort of filter out those harmful kind of chemicals in the tobacco smoke that would be causing cancer. Now, we're going to look at that aspect in terms of filters right now. And interestingly enough, though, who were the first early adopters of filtered cigarettes? Women, especially women, and to a lesser extent, young people. And that's a curious thing, because normally we think of young people as not caring about their health and thinking they'll live forever or something. But in fact, there were very high rates of filtered cigarette use happened amongst people under 24. So when I talk about this, you're going to actually see examples of the market research reports that the tobacco companies did at this time in the 50s and 60s. I've just sort of cut and pasted some of this into the slides. I'm going to be looking at a particular set of market research surveys by this organization called Canadian Facts, which they did for the large tobacco company called Imperial Tobacco Canada. And these are really in-depth, rich, detailed surveys that were done from the mid-50s until well into the 60s. Large sample sizes, very solid kind of sampling frameworks, proper question wording. And so these are kind of high quality market research surveys for the time, and they can tell you lots about the behavioral and the behavioral aspects of smoking. They can tell you a lot about the sort of attitudes that people had towards smoking. And I think that these are what I call a kind of unparalleled historical resource. You can learn more about how Canadians understood smoking, or how they understood themselves as smokers, from these surveys in the 50s and 60s than you can from virtually any other type of social research that's out there. Of course, they were done for a tobacco company, and that's important to understand that. So I'm going to just quickly just go through some of the some parts from the research studies here. And again, my point here is just to show how quickly filtered. What you had was some existing brands starting in 53, 54. Existing brands, they started introducing a filtered version of these brands. And then they started to see, well, how do these brands sell? And you can see here with this table I have from one of the market research reports from 56. So this is about 3 or so years after the initial cancer scare. You can see here that already 33% of women smokers have adopted a filtered tip brand or a filtered brand, compared to just 13% of men. You can see for amongst young people, the rates is higher for men, say 18% versus 10% who are 40 and older. But for women, it's much higher too, right? It's 37% of women between 18 and 25 are opting for filters. You also see a big difference in terms of high income people choosing filtered brands over middle or lower income people. And again, the thinking here is that if you're from a high income background, you may have a sort of higher education level. You may be more aware of health issues and some of the research that's been coming out about cigarettes and cancer. So you're more likely to respond to that in terms of a choice that you believe is healthier, which is choosing a filter brand. women arguably as well have traditionally been conditioned to take health more seriously than men. In part, that has to do with the way they're socialized. In part, it has to do with being a mother versus being a father at this time, when mothers were it took on a lot of the responsibility, the health of the family, and that sort of thing. All right. So here's just a couple other tables where you can see, now we're into 1958, and you can see that the men who are smoking filters, it's only 28%, but women are now past 50%. 52% of women who are smokers have now opted for filtered brands. And you can see amongst those younger people between 18 and 25, those numbers are higher for that age group than they are for the older age group. So there's something going on with young people at this time. Now, whether you consider 18 to 25 young, or we'll get to that in a second once the surveys start getting start surveying teens under 18. I don't really have a clear explanation for why somebody under 25 would be more health concerned than somebody who was, say, in their 30s or 40s. One possibility is to consider that a young person is more likely to be a starter smoker. They're more likely to be, and it may be that when you start with a filtered cigarette, it may be a more pleasant experience because it's not as harsh and you don't get sort of tobacco bits in your mouth and that sort of thing. So there could be that aspect of just them being in the starter phase, and with the filters being available to them, they would opt for that. You can see here what you have. These are some brands here, and the Matinée is a specific filter brand. So this was a new brand that was introduced as a filter-only brand. And you can see here that amongst women, it's doing very well. Just 2 years after the brand was introduced, you can see that it has a large market share amongst women, especially women under age 25. So Matinée is an important brand for all of this, right? And I just want to talk a little bit about it. So it was introduced by Imperial Tobacco in 1954. And it's the first notable filter brand. So a brand that only exists as filtered, right? It's not a case of there being Players, which is unfiltered, and Players, which is filtered. This is a filter-only brand. And it comes out in 1954 as a direct response to the lung cancer scare that was scaring the tobacco companies. And it was designed, in terms of the marketing, to promote a message of health reassurance for smokers. And the ads would talk about the filter technology in the Matinée cigarettes as being exceptional, that it would filter out all of these, these particulates and these harmful chemicals and that sort of thing. Now, interestingly enough, when the brand, if you look at the advertising when it first comes out in 54, and even sort of in the mid-50s, I would say, it's not explicitly targeting women. There's a kind of a bi-gender aspect. You'll see men and women depicted in the ads. You can see this one, I would say, has a bit more of an appeal for women because of the way she's looking at him, and she seems to be more in power and control. But by and large, it wasn't explicitly a woman's brand when it came out in 54, 55, 56, but it gradually becomes that. And you can see it becomes that by the late, starts to happen, or starts to occur in the late 50s. And in part, this happens because women, it happens because women disproportionately become concerned with the health issues around smoking as compared to men. And so the brand that was at that time the most prominent kind of filter brand that was promoting a kind of reassurance message around smoking, as long as you smoked a filter brand, you'd be okay, that would have more appeal to women than to men. And so over time, this brand started to capture a larger share of women than men. And so it became almost a self-fulfilling prophecy. At a certain point, the brand becomes more and more explicitly female in terms of its marketing and in terms of the actual market share amongst women itself. Now, one of the questions you might ask, were filters safer for smokers? Like, did it actually mean that if you put a filter on a cigarette compared to non-filtered cigarettes, that the smokers of filters may actually be getting a marginally healthier cigarette? And in fact, there's virtually no evidence in support of that. Not at the time and not since. Effectively, if you're a filtered smoker, a filtered cigarette smoker, you're more or less getting the same kind of harmful chemicals and cancerous kinds of smoke inhalation that you would be getting if you were smoking that same cigarette without the filter. All right. Now, the perception that people had at this time was the exact opposite, right? Here's a survey question in 1958 asking people, are filtered tips, are they safer for you than plain N brands, so brands that don't have filters on them? And you can see here 72% say yes, they agree that filtered brands are safer. And so effectively what that means, if you actually take out the undecideds, the no ideas, the breakdown here would be 84% saying they're safer and only 16% saying they're not safer. So overwhelming opinion exists on the part of people, on the part of smokers, that filter, if you're concerned about health, filters are a really great branding option. And so what this means, as you get to the late 50s and early 60s, there's just this large group of smokers out there now who aren't willing to quit smoking, but they are willing to remain as smokers provided they could get a certain kind of health reassurance with the marketing and the branding and the actual products themselves. And so what you start to see are these tobacco companies by the early 60s even talking about a health segment of the market. They even start using terms like a form of health marketing in terms of promoting cigarettes, a product which by the early 60s, even the tobacco company's own in-house scientists knew was cancerous. And yet they came to believe that they could convince smokers to continue smoking as long as there were sufficient forms of health reassurance marketing available to them. And you can see here, this is from one document, that they're asking about filter smokers and whether they which ones they think are safer. They often name their own filter brand, but the strongly pronounced that the question of health, which strongly suggests that health is a motivating factor in brand selection to filtered smokers. They're not just picking the brand because they like the advertising or they like the look of the package or they think there's something sexy about the messaging of that. No, they're actually picking certain brands because they believe they're healthier than other brands. Matinee smokers seem most dedicated to the superior health aspect of their brand. So the dominant factor in terms of the brand identity of Matinee and the part of the people who buy that brand is health. They think of that as a health brand as opposed to other brands which they think of as unhealthy. So the Rothmans, despite the latter's heavy promotional efforts, and so basically the brands like Matinee, De Moray, both made by Imperial Tobacco, and to a certain degree brands from Rothmans were seen to be more healthy in terms of particular branding and advertising that was done in this sense. Okay, so that's the health issue, okay? That's how they were able to foster an impression that certain types of brands were healthier than others. What I want to do now is I want to look at how the industry starts to target young people. And by this, I mean people as young as 15, people under 18, and how they start to do this in the 1960s, and why they do this. Why is there a kind of commercial imperative almost for tobacco companies to believe that targeting teenagers is a smart marketing strategy. Okay, so if you were to look at the cigarette industry in the 1940s and 50s, based on the advertising and other aspects of it, you generally would come up with the impression that it was a fairly adult-oriented marketplace. The advertising often had people that were, say, in their 30s, 40s, sometimes even older. If you looked at the consumer research, it was generally geared towards adults. If you looked at the ad campaigns, the marketing strategy, it was largely framed in terms of an adult marketplace, people in their 20s and up. Now, this is going to change in the 60s, where tobacco companies become preoccupied with targeting teen smokers. And I just put up an example of this, and there was real success in terms of getting teen girls to increase their smoking rates. So you can see here, this is a table, and you can see that at the start of the 60s, about 40%, 46% of boys who are 15 to 19 are smoking, and that doesn't change a whole lot as you get into 1972, about a decade later. But you can see for girls, that's a very big increase to go from 27 to 40%. Girls are smoking almost at the rate of boys at that time in the early 70s. By the early 1980s, girls will surpass boys in terms of their teen girls anyway, will surpass boys in terms of their smoking rate. So we want to look at why is this happening? Like why like for starters, like why do you have a 46% teen male smoking rate in 1963? I mean, that seems pretty high. How does that come into being and the rest? And so we're going to look at the early 1960s in terms of when cigarette makers start to target those teens and why they target them. One of the things you have to look at and consider is there was teen smoking, say, in the 1940s and 50s. So even when the marketplace was ostensibly adult-oriented in terms of the way marketers behaved and all the rest, there were still teens smoking. It was far less than 46%. We don't really know the exact numbers, but they existed out there. But it wasn't. They weren't constructed as a consumer segment, right? The tobacco companies did not look at rates of teen smoking in the 40s and going, hey, those kids are starting to smoke, we should go after them. That did not happen, really, at least in Canada, until the 1960s, when teens become an actual consumer segment. Okay, they're part of the marketplace now in terms of the way that they're targeted and stuff, whereas prior to that they existed kind of outside of conventional marketing and advertising. They were kind of smoking in violation almost of what the intended advertising targets were for cigarettes and the rest. Okay, so smoking arguably it becomes an important thing for teens, and as you'll see, even some of them are concerned about the health aspects of smoking, but smoking is a really vital thing for somebody. I would say it can become a vital thing for somebody who are in their teen years, which are all years that are very much linked to establishing one's own sense of self-identity, one's own sense of social belonging, and how to figure out how you can be successful with your peer groups. Those become really important, and so you're far more susceptible to turn to smoking if, in fact, smoking becomes more and more popular amongst your peers. So I want to start you with something here. So this is an example of a survey from 1962. Now note the top where the survey says we're going to ask everybody 15 years and over about smoking habits. And you can see one of the age groups there is 15 to 19. It lists the number of respondents, 1,602, and the percentage and whatever. Now keep in mind that prior to 1962, the minimum age for these surveys done for Imperial Tobacco was 18. And in 1962, they decide to change the way the survey was done to lower the minimum age to 15. All right? That tells you something. That tells you that if you're going to change the design of a survey and you're going to spend a lot more money interviewing more people who are younger, you don't just do that because, well, wouldn't it be nice to know what they think? We're not going to target them or anything like that, but hey, we'll spend the money and figure it out, and blah, blah, blah. No, it was part of an explicit reorientation of their marketing strategy, Imperial Tobacco and other tobacco companies, to recognize that targeting younger teens, not just 18 and 19-year-olds, was really important to the long-term success of a cigarette brand. And we'll come to that in a second. Okay, so here is an example of teen girls and filter brands. And you can see that these are people that are 15 to 19. And you can see that about 91% of girls by 1962 are smoking filtered cigarettes. So it's effectively the de facto choice now. Girls were more effectively brought into the smoking marketplace by filtered cigarettes, in large part because there was a messaging that went with them that suggested that they weren't so bad for you. They were just maybe a little bit bad, but they weren't kind of cancer bad. And that seemed to have more persuasive power with girls as opposed to young boys, who nonetheless still smoke filters at a higher rate than older men. Now, one of the things that comes out of the research, the surveys, and this is an example from one of the reports, which basically says that the teenagers were very receptive to the idea that filter brands were safer than others, and that there was a general switch to filtered cigarettes since 1961 has been spearheaded by smokers, both male and female, in the younger age group. So there's something going on with teens that they were drawn to filtered brands, at least in this decade. And they were drawn to those brands. It was often making it easier for them to enter the realm of smoking, to start off as smokers. And in some ways, you might think about maybe a filtered brand is an easier entry vehicle or initial pathway into smoking. Most kids, when they start smoking, and you'll see they start mostly when they're 14, 15, and 16, the initial smoking experience is difficult, right? It can be very overwhelming to have that kind of tobacco intake. Sometimes people get lightheaded. Sometimes they would throw up. You have to smoke a few cigarettes a number of times before you think it's anything you'd ever want to do. Okay? So possibly a filter on the cigarette made that less harsh of an experience, and it may have actually meant that those novice smokers ended up becoming regular smokers because of that. Okay, so why do teens matter? And I've got this initial stat up there. The teens between 13 and 19, the tobacco companies estimated in this, I think this is from the 70s, that only about 2% of their revenues come from this age group. Now, you would say, well, that's 6 years, so there should be more than 2%, right? Well, in fact, when you're at that age group, you can't buy cigarettes every day. You're in school. You don't have the money. You're not a regular smoker like you might be when you're 30 or something like that, right? So they don't buy as much as they otherwise could if they weren't living at home and that sort of thing. And they have less money than the rest. So just 2% of revenues, right? And yet that becomes a really important 2% for these tobacco companies. Because what they found was that, yes, maybe having those smokers as teens doesn't really bring you in a lot of revenue because they don't really buy a lot during those years because they're kids. They don't have a lot of money. But the finding was that if you started off as a player smoker when you were 15 or 16 and you sort of stuck with that brand for a year or two, there was a very good chance that you would remain a player smoker into your 20s and the years beyond. And what the research showed was that getting teens to start with your brand and to stick with your brand for a while when they were teens was a very strong predictor of how the success of that brand as those kids aged into their 20s. So in terms of establishing brand loyalty among new smokers, the 15 to 24 age group, this is from a marketing report, is of course critical and is likely to remain so, right? You had to get your brand into the hands of young people in order to have a chance for them to want to smoke your brand when they became 20-somethings and 30-somethings. So it may only be 2% while they're actually teens, but the big payoff would come in subsequent years. Now, the other factor during this period, and here we could be talking about the 1960s right up into the 80s, was a kind of paradox of cigarette marketing involving youth, teens. Now, the industry's publicly stated position was that they never targeted teens. They said they only targeted people who were 18 and older, or I guess adults, I should say, instead of teens, because 18, you're both a teen and an adult. But effectively, they said, we only target adults. We have an advertising code where we lay out all these things we do not do in terms of advertising that may appeal to young people. And they had those positions because they wanted to avert any kind of government regulation of the cigarette industry, right? Politicians and people in general may really have a concern with the actions of tobacco companies if they thought they were actually going after young people. They would have thought that that would be underhanded or patently something that was distasteful. So the tobacco companies had those public positions, and they did that to avert government regulation. Privately, in terms of their own commercial operations, in terms of their own market research, in terms of the way they conceived of advertising and marketing campaigns, etc., they were targeting young people, people as young as 15. In fact, I've seen some surveys where they're as young as 13. They were targeting them because of that point that I just mentioned, right? The commercial imperative that teens were critical for the long-term success of a brand. If you could get your brand to the hands of teens, the long-term success of that brand would be much better than you hoping that somebody in their 20s may do this. And part of the reason for this is that you ask, well, when did people start becoming smokers, right? Well, 70% of people who become regular smokers, 70% are doing so before they turn 18, right? 20% of people started smoking before the age of 14. So more than 2/3 of people are actually regular smokers before they become adults when they're 18. So the thinking on the part of those tobacco companies is that, well, we're going to have to target those young people, those teens. Even if we say we're not doing it, we're going to have to come up with ways to try and appeal to them. Smoking becomes popular with teens. In part, it's because of the advertising and the marketing, but it also has to do with the kind of space you find yourself in as a teen, right? It's a very kind of socially sort of difficult time for many people. You're transitioning from being a child to being an adult. Smoking might be seen as a kind of a passport to adult status. Interestingly, you can smoke because you know that adults smoke and you can try and emulate adults, but you also can smoke because you know that adults will not be happy with you smoking, right? And you like that too, right? Smoking can be a form of social belonging, fitting in. It can also be an affirmation of one's personal kind of independence, a kind of FU to authority figures, and all the rest. All right. So here's a couple market research or marketing campaigns that were done to try and these were this advertising, for example, is done to appeal to young people through focus groups that were done with 16 and 17-year-olds in Quebec. This one's called Projet Jeunesse. And so this would be, they would ask people why they would start smoking. They would ask all these detailed questions in the focus groups about their sense of, freedom and how they see smoking as a break with childhood. They found out what types of brands were most popular with smokers as young as 16. And typically those were brands like Export A, Players, and De Maurier. Now they were finding, it's the late 70s, that boys were more wanting to demonstrate their bravado or their risk-taking appeal. They were looking for stronger cigarettes because they thought that made them cooler. So the health issue, as you get into the late 70s, is no longer so much seen with boys in terms of those in their teens. And they become, they wanted a strong brand, quote, to prove that they could smoke them to their. One of the interesting things they found with this study was that the decision around smoking or starting to smoke with these kids didn't really happen in a dating context. And that's because most of these kids were starting to smoke when they were 14, 15, and 16. They were actually starting to smoke before they were actually dating. And so factors around what, a date or a girlfriend or a boyfriend or whatever would consider about, so it wasn't even part of their thinking about why they got into smoking. It wasn't really to entice a prospective date or to look cool to them. It was actually more for their own kind of male-only peer group or their female-only peer group. So this was a similar thing that was done in Ontario. It's the same kind of focus group, only with kids in Ontario. And here you see things like a lot of similarity actually with these Quebec kids and these Ontario kids, right? You start smoking for independence. Cigarettes were associated with adulthood, at the same time involved adults seeking to deny them to young people, right? So they had this sort of interesting appeal about being something you could do to sort of show that you could be an adult, but also something that you knew that would have adults upset with you, which could be quite reaffirming as a teen. You proclaim your break with childhood. And by this point, there are just fewer and fewer health concerns on the part of these young people. 15 years ago, there were health concerns. By now, they seem to be gone, especially boys. So this ad is an example of an ad that would have come out of this type of research. And it's interesting because, on the one hand, if you look at this ad, you wouldn't necessarily think this is an ad that explicitly targets young boys, like teen boys. You just think, well, there's a kind of action scene. The people in the ads are older than teens, etc. But this ad actually tested really well amongst these teens, especially the boys. And it's because it's not just a depiction of skiers on a hill. It's a depiction of one of the skiers breaking away from the other two and actually proclaiming, like the ad actually is a visualization of that break with childhood or that break with your authority figures that are bothering you. It's a way of breaking away from those teachers that seem to have you down all the time, or nosy parents, or that sort of thing. That out on that ski slope, when you can get by yourself and you can literally be suspended in air like that, in terms of what you see depicted there, that this actually is a message that resonates with those boys, those teen boys, even ones that have never skied before. All right? So just as there's no parents or teachers on that ski slope, there are none in Marlborough country, and that's what we're going to talk about after the break. All right? Cheers.